Before the handcuffs, before the shouting, before any of it, Wendell was just trying to eat his soup. That's the part that keeps coming back. Not the confrontation, not what happened after. Just the image of a 63-year-old man sitting alone at a table by the window of a hotel restaurant in downtown Savannah, Georgia, wearing a clean gray sweater and reading glasses, with a bowl of she-crab soup, going cold in front of him because his hands had started shaking too hard to hold the spoon. His name was Wendell Okafor-Price. Most people who knew him called him Mr. Price. His late wife had called him Wendell. The front desk staff at the Hargrove Grand Hotel, on the rare occasion they acknowledged him at all, called him nothing. They simply looked through him the way people look through a smudged window. He had checked in 2 days earlier, traveling from Columbus, Ohio, to attend his granddaughter's college graduation at Savannah State. He had booked the room 6 weeks in advance. He had packed carefully. The gray sweater, a navy suit for the ceremony, his good shoes, the ones he saved. He had driven instead of flown because his knees didn't do well on airplanes anymore, and because he liked the quiet of a long road. 14 hours. He'd stopped twice. The Hargrove Grand was not cheap. It was not a place people wandered into by accident. But Wendell had saved for this trip specifically because his granddaughter, Amara, his daughter Patricia's youngest girl, had asked him to be there. She had asked him 6 months ago. She had called him on a Sunday morning, which she never did, and said, "Grandpa, I need you there. Not just someone. You." So he came. He came and he ate breakfast alone on the first morning because Patricia and the kids weren't arriving until the afternoon. He sat at a table in the Magnolia Grill, which was what the hotel called its restaurant, with its dark wood paneling and its framed photographs of the Georgia coastline and its cloth napkins folded into little crests on the plates. He ordered the she-crab soup and a glass of sweet tea. He read his newspaper. He minded his business entirely. That was when Boyd Mercer noticed him. Boyd Mercer was the head of security for the Hargrove Grand Hotel. He had held the position for 11 years. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of wanting to appear larger than one actually is. He wore a navy blazer with the hotel's gold crest on the breast pocket. He carried a radio on his hip and a set of keys that he had a habit of jingling when he walked, as if the sounds itself was a warning. He saw Wendell from across the restaurant, and something in him shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer, just a slight narrowing of the eyes, a recalibration, the kind of look that some people have practiced so long they no longer recognize they're doing it. He crossed the dining room slowly. He passed 3 other tables without stopping. He stopped at Wendell's. "Sir!" he said. Wendell looked up from his newspaper. He took a moment, the kind of moment a man takes when he has spent his whole life learning to take moments, to breathe, to not react before he understands what he is reacting to. "Good morning," Wendell said. Boyd Mercer did not return the greeting. "Are you a registered guest of this hotel?" The dining room was not loud. Several tables nearby went quieter. Wendell set his newspaper down. "I am. I'm going to need to see your room key, sir." "I'm sorry, your room key, or your reservation confirmation. Something that establishes that you're a guest here." Wendell looked at the table in front of him. The cloth napkin, the half-eaten bowl of soup, the glass of sweet tea. The newspaper folded to the crossword section. He looked back up at Boyd Mercer. "This is the restaurant," Wendell said carefully. "I came down for breakfast. I understand that. I still need to verify. Do you ask everyone in here to verify?" Boyd Mercer did not answer that question. He simply waited, in the way that people with a certain kind of authority wait, not impatiently, but with the silent implication that they have all the time in the world and you do not. A woman at the table to Wendell's left had stopped eating. Her fork was suspended midair. She was staring at her plate. A couple near the window had turned slightly away. In that particular posture of people who are witnessing something uncomfortable and have decided the most important thing is not to be involved. Nobody said a word. Wendell reached into the pocket of his gray sweater and produced his room key card. He placed it on the table without handing it over, because his hands were shaking and he did not want Boyd Mercer to see them shake. He didn't want to give him that. Boyd Mercer picked it up. He looked at it. He set it back down. "Thank you," he said, in the tone of a man who is not actually grateful. He did not leave. "Is there something else?" Wendell asked. "This dining room is for registered guests and their invited parties. I know that. Just making sure everything is in order." "Everything is in order," Wendell said. "I've been eating here for 2 mornings." "Yes, sir. Enjoy your breakfast." He turned and walked away. He did not jingle his keys this time. The dining room slowly exhaled. Forks resumed. Someone coughed. The woman to Wendell's left finally lowered her fork to her plate, though she didn't eat anything. She just looked at it. Wendell stared at his soup. It had gone cold. He did not call the front desk. He did not ask to speak to a manager. He went back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. In the way that people sit when they are trying to figure out whether what just happened actually happened, or whether they misread it, or whether they are too old and too tired to decide which possibility is worse. His phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "We're 3 hours out. Amara is so excited. She keeps asking if you're already there." He typed back, "I'm here. Can't wait to see you both." He set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the wall. He had spent 41 years as a structural engineer. He had designed bridges, not metaphorical bridges, actual ones, spanning actual rivers, carrying actual weight. He had a wall in his house in Columbus covered in framed diplomas and commendations and one photograph of him shaking hands with the governor of Ohio at a ribbon-cutting ceremony on a bridge he had designed in 1998. He had worked for the same firm for 30 years before retiring. He had never once been late. He had raised 2 children by himself after his wife passed. He had paid every tax, attended every parent-teacher conference, voted in every election since 1982. None of that was visible to Boyd Mercer. None of it would be. The graduation ceremony was the next morning. Wendell wore his Navy suit. He sat in the bleachers beside Patricia and watched his granddaughter walk across the stage in her cap and gown and accept her degree in civil engineering, which was not a coincidence. She had chosen that field because of him, because of the hours he had spent with her as a child explaining load distribution and stress points, and why a bridge doesn't fall. When her name was called, Patricia grabbed Wendell's arm with both hands and squeezed, and Wendell found that he could not speak, which was fine, because there was nothing adequate to say. They celebrated that evening at a restaurant off Congress Street, the whole family. Patricia, her husband, Amara's roommate, who had nowhere else to go, and Wendell, who ordered ribs and ate every bite and laughed at things he hadn't laughed at in months. He went back to the hotel at 10 o'clock, content in the way that only specific hard-earned moments can produce. The trouble started the next morning. His last full day in Savannah. He came down for breakfast again at 7:30. Same table by the window. He had started to think of it as his table, which was probably a mistake. Same soup. Different newspaper. He had bought the Savannah Morning News from a box on the corner, which he was reading with his glasses perched on the end of his nose when he heard the voice. "Sir!" He looked up. Boyd Mercer again. This time not alone. There was a younger man with him, also in a hotel blazer, early 30s, with someone following orders he hadn't fully thought through. "Good morning," Wendell said. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Wendell set down the newspaper, slowly. "I beg your pardon. We've received a complaint." "What kind of complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to go into specifics. I'm going to ask you to come to the security office so we can sort this out." Wendell looked around the dining room. It was busy. Maybe 20 people at various tables. Some of them were already watching. The woman from the previous morning was there again, at the same table, and she was watching too, though she quickly looked away when Wendell caught her eye. "I am eating breakfast," Wendell said. "I am a registered guest of this hotel. I have a room key, which you have already verified, and you are asking me to leave this dining room based on an unspecified complaint. I understand this feels intrusive. It doesn't feel intrusive. It is intrusive." Boyd Mercer's posture changed. Nothing dramatic. Just a small hardening around the jaw, a slight forward lean that telegraphed, even if he didn't intend it to, that he was done treating this as a polite request. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with me voluntarily. If you don't, I'll have to involve the Savannah Police Department, and this will become more complicated than it needs to be." The dining room was very quiet. Wendell thought about his granddaughter the night before, accepting her diploma. He thought about the bridge in Ohio, the one with his name in the engineering records. He thought about the 41 years, the 2 children, the 14-hour drive, the good shoes. He put both hands flat on the table. His voice was perfectly level. "You will not threaten me," he said. "I have done nothing. I am eating breakfast, and if you call the police, I will be sitting right here in this chair when they arrive." Boyd Mercer stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the younger man beside him and said quietly, "Call them." The younger man nodded and stepped away, lifting the radio. What happened next happened fast. A woman 3 tables away stood up. She was perhaps 60, white, with silver hair and a linen blazer, and she said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "This is completely unacceptable." Not to Wendell. To Boyd Mercer. Mercer turned. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It concerns everyone in this room," she said. "This man has been sitting here eating his breakfast. I watched you do the same thing yesterday. What is the basis for this?" "Ma'am, hotel security matters are. I asked you what the basis is." A man at another table cleared his throat and stood up as well. Then a couple near the far wall. It was not a mob, nothing dramatic, just people, one by one, quietly getting to their feet or setting down their silverware or turning their chairs. The accumulated weight of attention in a room where people had decided, one by one, that the invisible line had been crossed. Boyd Mercer looked around. His certainty flickered. The younger staff member came back. He leaned close to Mercer and said something Wendell couldn't hear. Mercer's jaw tightened. The thing that had been called, the thing Mercer had said would make this more complicated, had arrived. But not as Mercer had intended. The 2 officers who walked into the Magnolia Grill 11 minutes later were a man named Officer Dana Sully and his partner, Officer Reese Tatum. They were professional. They were calm. They surveyed the room and then spoke briefly to Boyd Mercer near the entrance. Wendell watched Mercer explain. He watched Mercer's hands move. He watched Mercer point at him. Then he watched Officer Sully's expression. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic, adding up what he was seeing against what he was being told, and finding that the numbers did not match. Sully walked over to Wendell's table. He crouched down slightly to speak at eye level, which Wendell noted, and which meant something. "Sir, can I get your name?" "Wendell Okafor-Price." "Mr. Price, can you tell me what's going on from your end?" Wendell told him. Quietly, start to finish, the first morning, the request for his key, this morning's demand to leave, the threat of calling police. He spoke without agitation because he had spent 63 years learning that agitation, in circumstances like these, is almost always used against you. Sully listened. He asked 2 questions. He stood up and went back to Boyd Mercer. What was said between them, Wendell could not hear. But he watched Mercer's face through the whole conversation. He watched the particular progression that a certain kind of face goes through when the ground shifts. First impatience, then explanation, then justification, then a very different kind of stillness. The woman in the linen blazer was still standing. She had not sat down. Sully came back to Wendell. "Mr. Price, I'm going to ask you a few more questions, but I want you to know you are not the issue here." Wendell nodded. He had known this, but hearing it said out loud, in a room full of people, was something different. What emerged over the following 40 minutes? From Sully's conversation with Mercer, from a review of the hotel's security footage, from several guests who chose to give statements to Officer Tatum, was a picture that the Hargrove Grand Hotel would spend the next several weeks trying to manage. There had been no complaint, not a real one. Boyd Mercer had fabricated the basis for the removal request. The security footage showed him entering the dining room both mornings, specifically after spotting Wendell, and not after being called by anyone. On the first morning, He had walked past 4 other guests without stopping. On the second morning, the same. The pattern was not subtle once you were looking for it. The woman in the linen blazer turned out to be a retired circuit court judge named Harriet Colson Beauchamp, who had relocated to Savannah 3 years prior and ate at the Magnolia Grill twice a week. She gave a statement that was, by all accounts, extremely thorough. Boyd Mercer was placed on administrative suspension pending investigation before noon. He was terminated within the week. The civil complaint that followed was filed by Wendell's daughter, Patricia, who was also an attorney, which Wendell had not mentioned to anyone at the hotel because it had not seemed relevant. It shouldn't have needed to be relevant. The hotel settled out of court. The terms were confidential. Boyd Mercer appealed his termination on the grounds that he had been acting within the scope of his authority to verify guest legitimacy. The appeal was denied. The investigation had found, among other things, that Mercer had a documented pattern of complaints filed against him over his 11 years at the property, most of which had been quietly resolved or dismissed. The hotel's parent corporation, upon discovering this during discovery proceedings, chose not to defend the appeal particularly vigorously. Wendell drove home to Columbus the following Monday. He took a different route than he had on the way down, through the Carolinas, up through Virginia, which he hadn't seen in years. He stopped at a diner outside of Richmond and ordered coffee and eggs and ate by the window, watching the morning traffic move past. The waitress refilled his coffee without being asked. She called him Hawn. She was probably his daughter's age. He sat there for a long time. His granddaughter called while he was on the road somewhere in Virginia. She had heard the full story by then. Patricia had told her everything, which Wendell had known she would, because Patricia had never been particularly good at keeping things that made her angry contained. "Grandpa," Amara said. She didn't say anything else for a moment, just his name. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you are. That's not. I just." She took a breath. "I'm really angry. I know. You shouldn't have had to." No, he said. "I shouldn't have." He let that sit there between them, because sometimes the truest thing is also the simplest thing, and dressing it up doesn't make it more true. "Are you going to be okay driving?" she asked. "I've been okay driving for 40 years. That's not an answer." "Yes," he said. "I'm going to be okay." He was. He pulled into his driveway at 9:15 that evening. He carried his bag inside. He hung up the navy suit and put his good shoes back in the box on the shelf. He made himself a cup of tea and sat in the kitchen for a while, in the particular quiet of a house that has been lived in for many years by someone who has learned to be at peace in it. On the wall of his study, between the framed commendations and the photograph with the governor, there was a small pencil sketch that Amasmara had drawn when she was 9 years old. It was a bridge. Not a particularly accurate bridge. The proportions were off, the cables wrong. But it had something right about it. Something that understood what a bridge was for, even if it didn't quite know yet how to make one stand. He had always thought he would eventually get it professionally framed. He never had. He looked at it for a long time that night. There are people in this world who see a 63-year-old man in a clean gray sweater eating breakfast alone in a hotel restaurant and see something that needs to be checked, questioned, removed, something that doesn't fit. And there are people who see that same man and see what is actually there. A grandfather who drove 14 hours to watch his granddaughter walk across a stage. The difference is not a small one, and the question worth sitting with, the one that doesn't go away when the civil complaint is settled, and the security guard is fired, and the story reaches its tidy end, is what you would have done if you had been sitting at one of those tables. Not the judge, not Officer Sully, not the people who eventually stood up, the ones who looked at their plates.